He was not lost. Not yet. On the morning of day 4, Mauro Prosperi was exactly where an Olympic athlete should be. Ahead of the pack, moving efficiently, body performing at a level most humans never reach in a lifetime of training. The Sahara Desert stretched in every direction at 40 degrees Celsius, and he was running through it. Not surviving it. Running. That distinction matters. It matters because of what came next. Because in the space of 1 hour, the most physically prepared man in that desert became the most desperate. Because the thing that came for Mauro Prosperi did not care about his medals, his training, his decade of elite competition. It came from the West, and it came without warning. And when it was done, the desert he had been racing through no longer existed. A different desert had taken its place. One that had no intention of letting him leave. What I'm about to tell you is not a cautionary tale about poor preparation or bad decisions. Mauro Prosperi made no bad decisions. He was better prepared than almost anyone who has ever entered this race. What happened to him in that desert is a story about what the natural world can do to a human being when it decides to, regardless of who that human being is. This is a story about 9 days, about what a man will do, what any of us might do when the alternative is to stop. This is the true story of Mauro Prosperi. In 1994, Mauro Prosperi was 39 years old and in the kind of physical condition that requires years of systematic, disciplined, almost monastic dedication to produce. He was a police officer in Rome, a husband, a father. He was also a former Olympic athlete, a competitor in modern pentathlon, the 5-discipline event that combines fencing, swimming, equestrian show jumping, pistol shooting, and cross-country running into a single test of complete athletic capability. Modern pentathletes are not specialists. They cannot afford to be. The event was designed by Pierre de Coubertin, the founder of the modern Olympics, to simulate the ordeal of a soldier behind enemy lines, fighting, swimming, riding an unfamiliar horse, shooting, and running to safety. To compete at Olympic level in this event is to be, by definition, one of the most comprehensively capable physical specimens on the planet. This is who Mauro Prosperi was when he arrived in Morocco in April of 1994 to run the Marathon des Sables. The Marathon des Sables, the Marathon of the Sands, is not a marathon in the conventional sense. It is 250 kilometers across the Sahara Desert, run in stages over 6 days, carrying your own food and equipment, in temperatures that routinely exceed 40 degrees Celsius in the shade. There is no shade. Competitors sleep in communal tents at desert camps. There are checkpoints, water rations, and race marshals. There are also sections where you run between checkpoints separated by 30 or 40 kilometers of open desert, where the only navigational aids are compass bearings and the occasional cairn. It is, by most assessments, one of the most physically demanding endurance events on Earth. Mauro Prosperi was not intimidated by it. He had trained for it. He had competed in events of comparable brutality. He was, by any objective measure, exactly the kind of person who should be able to finish the Marathon des Sables and finish it well. He arrived at the start line in good condition. The first 3 days went as planned. Day 4 began the same way. It did not end that way. The sandstorm arrived in the early afternoon of day 4. In the Sahara, these storms are called haboubs, walls of sand and dust that can rise to 3 kilometers in height and travel at speeds exceeding 60 kilometers per hour. From a distance, they look like a brown cliff moving across the horizon. By the time you understand what you are looking at, you have approximately minutes before it reaches you. There is no outrunning a haboub. There is no shelter from one in open desert. There is only what you do in the seconds before it arrives, and then, after that, endurance. Mauro saw it coming. He had enough time to pull his headscarf across his face, to drop to his knees, to make himself as small as possible against the desert floor. He breathed through the fabric. He kept his eyes shut. He did not move. The storm lasted 8 hours. 8 hours of wind that did not feel like wind. It felt like the desert itself had turned against him, like the sand was not blowing past him but through him, finding every gap in his clothing, every exposed surface, abrading skin through fabric, filling every hollow and crease with fine particulate that would take days to fully remove. The noise was total. Not loud in the way an explosion is loud. Loud in the way an ocean is loud, omnidirectional. A sound that came from everywhere simultaneously and blocked out every other input. He lay in it for 8 hours and he breathed through cloth and he waited. When the storm stopped, it stopped the way desert storms stop. Suddenly, completely, as if a switch had been thrown somewhere in the atmosphere. One moment the world was brown noise and 40-kilometer-per-hour sand. The next, silence. Blue sky. The brutal, indifferent clarity of the Sahara at late afternoon. Mauro Prosperi stood up and understood within seconds that he was in serious trouble. The sandstorm had not simply obscured the desert around him. It had remade it. The dunes had shifted. The landscape he had been running through, with its specific ridgelines, its rocky outcrops, its distant landmarks, no longer matched anything he could orient himself against. The race markers, the small flags planted in the sand by the organizers to mark the course, had been buried or blown away entirely. He was standing in a desert that looked like every other part of the same desert in every direction. He had a compass. He had a small amount of water. He had the food he had been carrying in his race pack. He had 9 days of survival experience as an athlete and a police officer. None of it told him which way to go. He picked a direction and started walking. This is the part of Mauro Prosperi's story that requires you to understand something about the human body in extreme heat before you can fully grasp what was happening to him in those first days. The human body at rest in moderate temperatures burns approximately 1,500 to 2,000 calories per day. An endurance athlete moving through 40-degree heat, carrying weight, navigating terrain, can burn 4 to 5 times that. The body's water requirement scales in parallel. Sweat rates in extreme heat can reach 1 to 2 liters per hour under exertion. The water Mauro was carrying, rationed for a race with scheduled checkpoints, was not designed for open-ended desert navigation. Every hour he walked in the wrong direction was an hour of deficit that compounded against itself. Dehydration slows cognition. Slowed cognition produces worse navigational decisions. Worse decisions extend time in the desert. Extended time in the desert increases dehydration. This is the spiral. This is what the Sahara was doing to Mauro Prosperi while he walked, compass in hand, in what he believed was the right direction. He was not walking toward the race route. He would not know this for days. What he knew, as the sun went down on the first night after the storm and he made camp in the open desert, was that nobody had passed him. No other competitors. No race vehicles. No helicopters doing sweeps. The desert was empty in every direction. He was alone. He rationed his water with the discipline of a man who understands what discipline is worth. He slept. He woke before dawn and began walking again. On the second day after the storm, his water ran out. Without water in the Sahara, the timeline to incapacitation is measured in hours, not days. The body's core temperature, without the cooling effect of sweat evaporation, begins to rise. At 38 degrees core temperature, cognitive function begins to degrade. At 40 degrees, organ damage begins. At 41 degrees, without intervention, a healthy adult will die. Mauro Prosperi was a former Olympic athlete with exceptional physiological conditioning. His body was more efficient, more resilient, more capable of withstanding stress than almost any other body in that desert. That conditioning bought him time. It did not buy him water. He was scanning the terrain, methodically the way a trained observer scans, when he saw the shape against the sand. It was a structure. low, partially buried, the color of the desert around it. A tomb. A traditional Muslim marabou. A small domed shrine built over a grave. This one ancient. Its plaster eroded to the texture of the dunes that surrounded it. He went inside. The interior was cool. Not air-conditioned cool, cooler than outside. By maybe 10 degrees, the thick earthen walls absorbing and insulating against the direct assault of the sun. In the context of what Mauro had been enduring, 10 degrees of difference was the difference between function and collapse. He looked up. The ceiling was covered with bats. Dozens of them, clustered in the darkness of the dome, hanging in the specific stillness of roosting animals that have not yet registered a threat. He looked at them for a long moment. Then he took out his penknife. What Mauro Prosperi did next is not presented here for shock value. It is presented because it is what happened, and because understanding it is essential to understanding the nature of the choice he was making. He was not panicking. He was not acting irrationally. He was doing the arithmetic of survival with the cold clarity of a trained athlete who understands that the body requires inputs to function and that the only available inputs were above his head. He caught the bats. He used the knife. He drank what the bats contained. The blood was warm. It was not much. A small animal's blood volume is small, but it was moisture, and moisture was the only currency that mattered. He ate the meat as well, raw, without consideration for what that meant in terms of conventional food safety, because conventional food safety was a concern for a man with options. He had no options. He had bats. He also drank his own urine. This is a survival technique that exists in more nuance than the popular understanding of it suggests. Urine in the early stages of dehydration is relatively dilute and contains moisture the body can partially process. Mauro knew this. He used it. He stayed in the tomb. He emerged at night to walk, navigating by stars, covering ground in the hours when the temperature dropped enough to make movement survivable. During the day, he returned to the shade of the structure and rationed every input his body could process. On the 5th day, he made a decision. This is the part of Mauro Prosperi's story that is the hardest to tell and the hardest to hear, and also the most important. He had been in the desert for 5 days since the storm. He had had no water except what he had extracted from bats and from his own body. He had eaten raw animal tissue. He had walked and navigated and rationed and fought with everything a decade of elite athletic training had given him to fight with. And he understood, with the specific clarity that extreme physical degradation produces, a clarity that strips away everything except the most fundamental calculus, that he was going to die in this desert. Not as a failure of will, not as a failure of preparation, as a mathematical certainty. The desert was larger than his water supply. The gap between those two quantities was not closable. He decided that dying of heat stroke, which he had seen described, which he understood to involve confusion, seizure, organ failure, a slow and undignified dissolution, was not how he wanted to go. He took out the penknife. He cut his wrists. He lay back in the darkness of the tomb and waited. He did not die. He lay there, and his blood, thickened by 5 days of severe dehydration to a consistency that bore little resemblance to the blood of a normally hydrated person, barely flowed. The cuts closed. The blood, too thick to circulate freely, coagulated against the wounds almost immediately, sealing them with the efficiency of a body so desperate for every resource it possessed that it refused to surrender even what he was trying to give away. He woke up the next morning, alive, with the specific, undeniable evidence that his body was not done, that it had, against his explicit instructions, decided to continue. He lay in the dark of the tomb for a long time. Then he stood up, walked to the entrance, looked out at the Sahara, and made a different decision. If his body was going to insist on surviving, he was going to help it. What followed was not a recovery. It was a renegotiation. Mauro Prosperi left the tomb and walked. The The direction no longer mattered in terms of race strategy. There was no race anymore, no checkpoints, no ranking. Direction mattered only in one sense. He needed to find people. Any people. A road, a track, a settlement, a nomadic camp. Any sign that the human world still existed somewhere beyond the sand. He moved at night. He sheltered during the day. He ate whatever the desert offered. Small lizards caught by hand. A snake dispatched with the knife that had failed to kill him. Insects. Things he did not examine before consuming because examination required a relationship with the food that he could not afford to have. He was losing weight at a rate that would alarm any physician who saw the numbers. Grams of muscle and fat burning as fuel every hour, the body eating itself from the inside to keep the engine running. His urine, when he could produce it, had darkened to a color that indicated kidney stress. His vision was affected. His concentration came and went in waves. He kept walking. He sang to himself. Italian songs, folk songs, things his mother had sung. Songs his children knew. He sang them quietly under his breath in the dark because the sound of a human voice, even his own, even slightly wrong in pitch from a dehydrated throat, was evidence that something human still existed in this desert. On the 9th day, he saw a figure, then 2 figures, then a group. A Tuareg family, nomadic Berber people who have navigated the Sahara for centuries, who know its routes and its water sources and its rhythms the way Mauro Prosperi knew the streets of Rome. They saw him before he reached them. They saw what he was, a man at the extreme edge of what a man can endure and still be standing, and they did not hesitate. They gave him water. He drank it and immediately vomited. His body, so thoroughly adapted to managing without moisture, could not process a sudden input. They gave him small amounts, and then small amounts again, and then again. He was alive. He was not in Morocco. This was the information that filtered through to him in pieces, through gestures and the fragments of language that crossed between them, in the hours after the Tuareg family found him. He had walked, navigating by stars and instinct and the desperate logic of a man with nothing left but forward momentum, more than 200 kilometers from the point where the sandstorm had taken him. He had crossed an international border without knowing it. He was in Algeria. The race he had entered, the Marathon des Sables, had been running its final stages while Mauro Prosperi was drinking bat blood in a desert tomb. The organizers had mounted a search. Aircraft had flown grid patterns over the Moroccan desert. His wife, Cinzia, had been notified. She had refused to accept the implications of that notification. She was right. He was evacuated to a hospital in Algeria. The medical assessment took time, not because his injuries were complicated, but because they were numerous and the doctors needed to establish a baseline before they could understand how far below it he had gone. He had lost 15 kilograms. His liver showed damage. His kidneys were functioning at a severely compromised level. He was unable to eat solid food and would remain unable to for months. He had been in the desert for 9 days. He had walked, by the estimate later reconstructed from his account and the geography, more than 240 kilometers from the point where the storm took him. He was 39 years old, and he should have been dead by every calculation the desert had made about him. The doctors who treated Mauro Prosperi in the weeks after his rescue spoke carefully about what they found. The dehydration was severe enough that they described it as among the most extreme cases of survival dehydration they had encountered in a living patient. The organ stress was real and lasting. The weight loss represented a physiological depletion that would take months to fully reverse. They did not have a clean explanation for the wrist wounds, for the coagulation that had sealed them. They noted it. They documented it. They used the word remarkable. His wife flew to Algeria. In the interview he gave many years later, Mauro described the moment he saw her at the hospital. He said he could not speak. He said he had spent 9 days in the desert talking to himself, singing to himself, conducting an internal monologue to keep his mind from detaching entirely from the project of survival, and when the person he had been talking to himself about finally walked into the room, the words stopped. There were no words left. There was only the fact of her being there. He recovered. It took longer than the doctors initially projected, because the body keeps its own timeline when it has been through what his had been through. The kidneys healed. The liver normalized. The weight came back slowly, the way weight comes back when the body is rebuilding rather than simply refilling. He ran the marathon des Sables again. Not once. Multiple times. He returned to the desert that had taken 9 days of his life, that had brought him to a point that most humans will never approach and survive, and he ran it again. Not to prove something to the desert. The desert does not receive proof. He ran it because he is the kind of person who does, and because returning was the only way to confirm that the 9 days had not taken something from him that could not be returned. The last time he ran the marathon des Sables, he was 64 years old. He finished. There is a version of Mauro Prosperi's story that focuses on the physical facts, the kilometers, the kilograms lost, the medical readings, the extraordinary biology of coagulating blood in a dehydrated body that refused to let him go. Those facts are real and they are extraordinary. But the fact that stays with you after everything else, after the bat blood and the tomb and the knife and the border crossed without knowing it, is the morning after. The morning he woke up and his body had said no. He could have interpreted that as a malfunction, as his biology failing him one more time in a desert that had already taken everything it could reach. Instead, he looked at the sealed wounds on his wrists and understood them as something else entirely. He stood up. He walked out of the tomb. He went back into the desert that had tried to keep him, and he walked out the other side. That is not a story about physical conditioning. Physical conditioning was the precondition. It bought him time, gave him tools, kept the machine running on empty longer than it should have run. But the machine that mattered was not the one that trained at Olympic level for a decade. It was the one that woke up on the 6th morning and decided that waking up was enough reason to continue. 11 kilometers into the Sahara, with nothing but a penknife and the stars and the sound of his own voice, Mauro Prosperi made the oldest decision a human being can make. He chose to be harder to kill than the desert expected. This has been the Unlost Files. If this story found you at the right moment, and some stories find people at the right moment, then you already know what to do with it. Subscribe if you want more. Leave a comment with the moment that stopped you, because everyone who hears this story stops at a different moment, and that says something worth knowing. I'll see you in the next one.